400-year history of chattel slavery and the ensuing decades of systemic economic exclusion. We are looking at a wealth ratio of roughly 6.5 to 1, derived from recent survey of consumer finances data, which forces a confrontation with the legacy of transforming human beings into property. It is impossible to analyze modern economic structures without first dissecting the foundational era where an entire population was subjected to centuries of uncompensated labor. William, when we examine this historical continuum, the starting point is the legal and philosophical shift that allowed a person to be legally classified as a piece of property, a process that fundamentally rewired the global economy. That transformation into property is the crucial mechanism of chattel slavery, distinct from previous historical forms of servitude, where a person might have retained some basic legal rights or humanity. Under the system developed during the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans were legally reduced to the status of real estate or livestock. They could be bought, sold, insured, inherited, and used as collateral for loans. According to historians studying the era, colonial laws were meticulously drafted to strip away personhood. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, for example, explicitly defined enslaved people as real estate. This was not merely a cultural attitude, but a strict legal framework designed to extract maximum labor without any obligation of compensation or basic human care. The economic output generated by this free labor over 4 centuries built the foundational wealth of several Western nations. The cotton, sugar, and tobacco produced by enslaved people fueled the Industrial Revolution and established modern financial systems, including banking and insurance sectors that directly profited from underwriting human property. The scale of that economic extraction is difficult to conceptualize, but recent efforts have attempted to put a hard number on the debt accrued over those 400 years. In 2023, the Brattle Group, a prominent economic consulting firm, published a comprehensive report estimating the financial damages of transatlantic chattel slavery. They calculated that former slave-owning nations owe an aggregate sum of nearly $108 trillion in reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans and the affected nations. The United States alone, according to this analysis, is responsible for approximately $26 trillion for its practice of slavery from 1776 to 1865, while the United Kingdom is estimated to owe $24 trillion. These numbers often shock people when they first hear them. How do economists even begin to calculate a debt of that magnitude, and what specific harms are they quantifying beyond just the unpaid wages? The Brattle Group economists, working alongside historians and legal experts, had to account for multiple layers of extraction and trauma. They did not just calculate unpaid wages based on historical labor rates, though that forms a massive baseline. They also factored in the compounded interest over centuries, much like any long-term debt would accrue. Furthermore, the estimates encompass the loss of life, the severe physical and psychological harm, the destruction of family structures, and the deliberate denial of opportunity. The average lifespan of an enslaved African working on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean was notoriously short, sometimes estimated at just 7 years after arrival, due to the brutal conditions. The economic models attempt to quantify the opportunity cost of entire generations being denied the ability to build and pass down capital. When you compound the value of that stolen labor and lost economic potential from the 17th century to the 19th century, the figures inevitably reach into the tens of trillions. It demonstrates that the wealth of the modern Western world is inextricably linked to this specific historical crime. That brings us to the international community's recent reckoning with this history. In March 2026, the United Nations General Assembly passed a landmark resolution officially recognizing the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. The resolution, which was proposed by Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama on behalf of the African Union, passed with an overwhelming majority of 123 votes. It specifically called for a structured dialogue on reparative justice and acknowledged the deep, enduring scars left on African societies and the diaspora. Yet, countries like the United States voted against it, and the United Kingdom abstained, citing concerns about applying modern legal standards to historical actions. The tension here is palpable. We have global recognition of the crime on one side and a strong resistance from the wealthiest beneficiary nations to accept the financial implications on the other. The tension stems from the principle of intertemporal law, which some diplomats, like the UK representatives at the UN, invoked to argue that slavery was technically legal under the laws of the nations that practiced it at the time. However, advocates for reparative justice counter that human rights supersede localized, historically corrupt legal frameworks. The UN resolution is significant because it establishes a moral and international legal consensus that the transatlantic slave trade cannot be treated as a mere historical tragedy, but must be addressed as a crime requiring material repair. President Mahama emphasized that this is about healing and addressing the systemic hollowing out of African societies. When millions of the youngest, strongest, and most productive members of a society are forcibly extracted over centuries, the demographic and economic collapse of those regions is inevitable. The lingering underdevelopment in many African and Caribbean nations is a direct downstream effect of that extraction, which the CARICOM Reparations Commission has also highlighted in their 10-point plan demanding debt cancellation and investment in public health and education. Moving from the global scale back to the domestic situation in the United States, the end of chattel slavery in 1865 did not reset the economic playing field. The transition from slavery was immediately followed by new systems of economic exploitation. Black Americans were pushed into sharecropping, trapped in endless cycles of debt to white landowners. When we look at the modern wealth gap, the $285,000 to $44,900 disparity we discussed at the beginning, it is clear that the lack of compensation for 400 years of labor was only the first phase of wealth deprivation. The subsequent century saw active state and federal policies designed to prevent wealth accumulation. Scholars like Richard Rothstein, who wrote about the color of law, have documented how federal housing policies actively excluded black families from the suburban housing boom of the mid-20th century. Those policies created a compounding effect of disadvantage. While white families were able to utilize government-backed mortgages to purchase homes in segregated suburbs, black families were subjected to redlining, a practice where banks and the government refused to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods. Homeownership is the primary engine of generational wealth in the United States. According to economic research, redlining alone is linked to an estimated $212 billion in lost home equity for black families since the 1930s. Furthermore, black veterans were largely shut out of the wealth-building provisions of the GI Bill, which funded college educations and home purchases for white veterans returning from World War II. When you combine the total lack of initial capital following emancipation with a century of Jim Crow laws, employment discrimination, and exclusion from federal wealth-building programs, the current wealth gap becomes entirely predictable. It is a mathematical certainty born from targeted policy. Survey of Consumer Finance's data reveals another layer to this disparity regarding the types of assets held by different groups. White households hold a disproportionate share of high-yield assets like housing equity and business investments. Conversely, the smaller amount of wealth held by Black and Hispanic households is often concentrated in lower-value, depreciating assets like vehicles. Research from the Urban Institute points out that business ownership, which is a massive driver of wealth, is significantly lower among Black households due to historical barriers in accessing venture capital and standard business loans. Even today, high-income Black families are often offered worse home financing products than lower-income white families, and Black-owned homes are systematically appraised at lower values than comparable homes in white neighborhoods. This suggests the mechanisms of wealth extraction and denial did not end with the Civil Rights Act. They merely evolved into more sophisticated financial instruments. The systemic nature of the current financial landscape reflects those historical roots. When assets are continuously undervalued, it prevents the leveraging of those assets for future investments, like paying for higher education or starting a business. The National Bureau of Economic Research projects that without significant intervention, the racial wealth gap will remain a permanent fixture of the American economy. Intergenerational transfers of wealth ensure that the descendants of those who benefited from historical policies continue to thrive, while the descendants of those who were made into property and denied compensation continue to struggle against a stacked deck. White families currently pass down a median inheritance of around $150,000 compared to just $20,000 for Black families. This is why economists argue that policies aimed merely at financial literacy or incremental reforms are insufficient. The gap is not the result of individual choices. It is the result of centuries of state-sanctioned wealth extraction. This brings us back to the core argument of the reparations movement. If the wealth disparity is a direct mathematical outcome of specific historical policies, beginning with 400 years of uncompensated labor as chattel property and continuing through modern financial discrimination, then a systemic material response seems logically necessary. The calls for reparations, whether in the form of direct cash transfers, massive targeted investments in housing and education, or baby bonds as suggested by economists like Derek Hamilton, are attempts to interrupt this steady state of inequality. The moral argument aligns with the economic data. A society cannot extract centuries of labor, build its foundational infrastructure on that extraction, legally bar the descendants from participating in the resulting economic boom, and then claim the resulting disparities are natural or self-inflicted. Exactly. The historical record is completely unambiguous. African people were transformed into property, a legal fiction enforced by extreme violence to serve as the economic engine for global empires. They were given nothing in return. When the system of slavery was finally abolished, slave owners in places like the UK were compensated for the loss of their property, while the formerly enslaved received no restitution. The historical trajectory from the auction block to the modern wealth gap is a single, unbroken line of economic policy. Acknowledging this reality, as the 2026 UN resolution attempts to do globally, is the necessary prerequisite for any genuine economic reconciliation. The trillions of dollars estimated by the Brattle Group represent more than just lost wages. They represent the stolen potential of millions of human beings over multiple generations. We are left confronting a stark reality where the past actively dictates the present material conditions of millions of people, demanding a response that matches the scale of the original extraction. Send this episode to someone who needs to understand the direct economic through line from historical enslavement to modern wealth inequality.